Good afternoon. While we're getting Professor George mic'd, I want to welcome you all to the 7th Annual Rosenkranz Debate. And I want to express our gratitude to the Rosenkranz Foundation for supporting this event. We've loved having, for the last 6 years, this Saturday centerpiece for our convention, an intellectually sharp one-on-one debate between two highly prominent legal theorists. This series started in 2008 with discussion between Judges Richard Posner and Mike McConnell. We've then had Judges Guido Calabresi and Frank Easterbrook, Professors Richard Epstein and William Eskridge, Paul Clement and Larry Tribe debated healthcare, Judge Kaczynski and Hadley Arkes debated. In 2013, we featured Randy Barnett and J. Harvey Wilkinson. And last year, Attorney General McCasey debated Dean Strawson. Usually this is a lunch event, but this time that schedule didn't work, and we're delighted to have it when we do have it here. So to moderate this debate, I want to introduce Judge Bill Pryor, who serves on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit and is a longtime friend of the Society, going all the way back to his founding the Federalist Society chapter at Tulane when he was a law student there. Judge Pryor, I'll turn it over to you.
We are fortunate to have two distinguished debaters this evening to debate the proposition that you have in your program. Robbie George, Professor Robert P. George, holds Princeton's celebrated McCormick Chair in Jurisprudence and is the founding director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. He is the chairman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. He has served on the President's Council on Bioethics and as a presidential appointee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. He has also served as a judicial fellow at the Supreme Court of the United States, where he received the Justice Tom Clark Award. He is a graduate of Swarthmore College and Harvard Law School and received a master's degree in theology from Harvard and a doctorate in philosophy of law from Oxford. John McGinnis is the George C. Dix Professor in Constitutional Law. Professor McGinnis is a graduate of Harvard College and of Harvard Law School, where he served as an editor of the Harvard Law Review. He also has a master's degree in philosophy and theology from Oxford. Professor McGinnis clerked on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia for then Judge Ken Starr. From 1987 to 1991, he was a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice. He is a past winner of the Paul Bator Award given by the Federalist Society to an outstanding academic under the age of 40. He didn't win it yesterday, though. Professor George will state the affirmative proposition. Professor McGinnis will speak in opposition. Professor McGinnis, a past officer of the Oxford Union, where he was the librarian, having lost out to a descendant of Winston Churchill in the race for the presidency of the Oxford Union. As he told me, he didn't have quite the pedigree. Professor George.
Thank you very much, Judge Pryor. It's an honor to be in your courtroom, and I'm sorry to be late. I'm also sorry to be reading my prepared remarks from my computer. I had counted on being here in plenty of time to print them off, hoping to work a little on the train, but since the train ended up being 2 hours delayed, I had to rush into the meeting, and I do thank everyone for your kind indulgence. Like everyone here, Judge Pryor, I'm grateful for your service both to our nation and to the cause of justice according to law. Thanks, too, to my pals, Gene Meyer and Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society for inviting me to participate in the 2015 Rosenkranz debate and for prevailing on my friend John McGinnis to be the other debater. And thanks finally to the Rosenkranz family for sponsoring this debate, and also, Nicholas, for the many great contributions to our civic culture that you've made and your family's made by providing forums like this one for discussing not only current affairs, but perennial principles. And today's debate really is about perennial principles. It's customary in debates between friends, especially friends who have the same basic political outlook, for the sparring partners to begin with some good-natured, humorous jabs at each other. However, today is a day of mourning. Mourning for the victims of the terrorist mass murder in Paris last night. So please excuse me for not honoring the custom on this particular occasion. Instead, let me simply say that it's always a pleasure to be with John McGinnis, whom I regard as not only one of the best scholars in the American Legal Academy, but also one of the finest men. He's a person whose integrity and civic mindedness are no less impressive than his outstanding intellectual qualities. Since John and I have never discussed religion, I have no idea whether John is religious, or if so, what religion he is. But he is certainly the kind of person our Constitution was made for. A person of virtue, someone whose character is such that he can be trusted with the responsibilities of freedom. John and I have been asked, as Judge Pryor said, to explore the proposition famously asserted by John Adams: our Constitution is made for a moral and religious people and is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So, was our Constitution made for a moral and religious people? Is it inadequate to the government of any other? Well, the first thing to note is that our Constitution is, to use Hayek's phrase, a constitution of liberty. Under it, the power of government over the people is checked and limited, and the people get a lot of freedom, or so in any event it was supposed to be. But freedom can be used for good or for ill. That's self-evidently and obviously true. Freedom can be used wisely or irresponsibly. What Adams and the other founders recognized was this: freedom does not guarantee virtue, and yet the maintenance of freedom itself and the cultivation of the cultural conditions of freedom require virtue. Freedom is placed in dire jeopardy when free people are or become corrupt or foolish. It's also placed in dire jeopardy when fear, absent the virtue of courage, induce people to abandon freedom for the sake of, say, security, be it economic or physical. Virtue, in other words, is among the cultural conditions of freedom, and it is necessary to the establishment and preservation, virtue is necessary to the establishment and preservation of freedom's other cultural conditions. And beyond that, there are other social goods, other aspects of the common good of any political society that require for their realization and their maintenance virtue among the people. When freedom degenerates into what our founders called license, these goods too are placed in grave peril. Now, all of this may be common sense, but my friends, it was a sense that was by no means common when Adams and his fellow founders launched what they themselves understood to be an experiment in republican government and ordered liberty. Experiments by their nature can fail. And it's a common sense that, as the conditions of contemporary intellectual life make all too clear, can be lost sight of and even forgotten. Indeed, it is a common sense that can be derided and mocked by people who regard themselves as too worldly, too sophisticated, too enlightened to believe in things like morality and virtue. So in the face of modern nihilism, sometimes paradoxically masquerading as the most high-minded moralism, the defense of Adams' proposition takes on a kind of urgency. Well, let's look at that proposition in the context in which Adams asserted it. Now, here are his words. I quote, "But should the people of America once become capable of that deep simulation toward one another and toward foreign nations, which assumes the language of justice and moderation while it is practicing iniquity and extravagance, and displays in the most captivating manner the charming picture of candor, frankness, and sincerity, while it is rioting in the rapine and insolence, this country will be the most miserable habitation in the world. Because we have no government armed with the power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion, avarice, ambition, revenge, and licentiousness would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net." It was then that he uttered the words that are the proposition of our debate today. Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. Now, among those who are intelligent, honest, and humble enough not to regard themselves as too worldly, sophisticated, and enlightened to take on board Adams' fundamental point about the dependence of the common good and indeed the flourishing of freedom itself on virtue, there will be some who say, well, yes, virtue surely is required, but individuals and even nations can be virtuous even if they are not religious. So Adams should have said, our Constitution was made for a moral people, whether or not they are religious. Well, are people who say that right? Adams was hardly alone among the founders in viewing morality and religion as required for the success of their experiment with a Constitution of liberty. In his farewell address, President George Washington famously said that, quote, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and to cherish them. A volume could not trace all their connections with private and public felicity." Now, so far in what I've quoted, and I've here not quoted all I'm going to quote from Washington's farewell address in that particular section. So far, what I've quoted, Washington is basically saying what Adams says. But the father of our nation then turned specifically to the question of whether we as a nation can get along without religion, can get along simply on the basis of virtue, ungrounded in religious faith. And here is how he answered it. Washington said, "Let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of a peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle." Now, I think this answer, which we have reason to believe was drafted by Alexander Hamilton, and I suspect refers to his political adversary, Thomas Jefferson. That was the peculiar mind that had benefited from a refined education. Now, I think that answer is a good answer. I think that's right, though more can and should be said. The answer concedes, it even uses the word concedes, that in the case of particular individuals, reason can indeed support virtue, even in the absence of what he calls religious principle. And those of us who are natural law theorists, Professor Arcus is here, some others in the audience, certainly I myself, are committed to that proposition. At least we can know what's right to a very considerable extent on the basis of the application of reason. But Washington supposes that such persons are rare. Their minds are of a peculiar structure. And they are among the few who, on top of that, have had the benefit of a refined education. What Washington calls national morality cannot be sustained by a few such people, even if they exist. Reason itself and experience teach us not to pin our hopes on virtue ungrounded in or unsupported by faith in God, or in people who are roving without the support of communities of faith, holding them accountable and reinforcing the message of moral obligation. Now, I suspect that Washington believed this because, like Adams, he believed that reason was a bit too uncertain a trumpet, and that human passions of the sort that compete with virtues and lead us into error and sin are in any event too powerful. Washington and Adams were, to be sure, men who believed in the power of reason. They were Enlightenment men. Their Constitution was one that would test whether societies of men really are capable of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. To quote Hamilton's famous line from Federalist 1, that every Federalist Society member has to recite by heart in order to gain admission. And they certainly did not believe, as so many ignorant secularists today seem to believe, that faith is the enemy of reason. I'm not saying that all secularists are ignorant. Those secularists who are so ignorant as to say that faith is the enemy of reason ought to be called what they are, ignorant. But they did believe, Washington and Adams did believe, in the power and importance of faith, and indeed in the harmony of faith and reason, when faith and reason were rightly understood. So those of us who believe, as Adams and Washington believed, that ours is indeed a constitution made for a moral and religious people, need not and should not suppose that those of our fellow citizens who are not religious believers, or for whom religious belief hovers only vaguely in the background of their consciousness, cannot be persons of virtue or good citizens. They can be. They may well, and many do, muster the moral resources to avoid falling into the vices that Adams and Washington rightly viewed as fatal should they become widespread to a free society. Some indeed are among those citizens whose selflessness and patriotism are such that they are prepared to volunteer missions in which they know they may very well be called upon to give what Lincoln described as the last full measure of devotion. And yet, dare we suppose that liberty-sustaining virtues can survive if the great mass of people over a great expanse of time lose or abandon a sense of the transcendent, the spiritual, the more than merely human sources of meaning and value. That, I would say, is a proposition that we should, as Washington warned, indulge with caution. And there is an additional reason for caution, a reason that goes to the distinctive nature of the American Constitution of Liberty. The Constitution bequeathed to us by men like Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, defended by Lincoln, effectuates a particular understanding of the nature and basis of just political order, one that is set forth with admirable clarity and with candor in the Declaration of Independence. The moral heart of that understanding is the idea of God-given natural human rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That proposition, no mere sentiment, that has inspired so many Americans, from our founders to Lincoln to Martin Luther King. The American proposition is that the basic rights, which it is government's highest duty to protect and strict obligation to respect, are not the gifts of kings or presidents, parliaments or congresses or courts. They are not given to us by any human power, so no merely human power may legitimately transgress them or take them away. It is the duty of human government, rather, to protect them and to respect them. Now, this is not an affirmation that can only be made by Christians and Jews, the heirs of the great biblical tradition of ethical monotheism. Certainly, Muslims, Sikhs, and people of other traditions of faith can make the affirmation. Even a deist, in the old-fashioned sense of that term, not perhaps the contemporary one, can make it. Jefferson, after all, speaking of slavery, said, and this is despite being a slave owner, as every college student today knows, even if he or she knows nothing else about Jefferson. And a shocking number know nothing else about Jefferson. Jefferson said, the deist, Jefferson said, "I tremble for my country when I consider that God is just, and his justice will not sleep forever." In a constitution of freedom, a constitution of liberty, and a political order built to be a republican political order, it's good for people to be able to say with a sincere heart about some potential wrong that they are tempted individually or collectively to commit, or that they are tolerating when they should not tolerate it. I tremble for my country when I consider that God is just and that his justice will not sleep forever. But what about the non-theists? Where are they in this? Well, there are non-theists and there are non-theists. There are non-theistic traditions, such as some forms of Buddhism, the Theravada Buddhism of Thailand and Southeast Asia, for example, that recognize the spiritual nature of man as in some sense a free and rational being, an agent. And typically these traditions, though God is not part of the picture, assume the existence of a transcendent reality in an economy in which the human person is subject to moral requirements and therefore responsible for his actions. As more than merely material creatures, human beings can have fundamental dignity, even sanctity, and be the subject of rights and duties. But things get murkier quickly when we consider forms of atheism that reject the transcendent, the spiritual, altogether, supposing that human beings are products of meaningless forces in a universe governed exclusively by material and efficient causes. In such a universe, human beings cannot truly have freedom of the will or capacities for more than merely instrumental rationality. How such creatures could possess dignity, much less sanctity, and be the bearers of unalienable, natural human rights is, to say the least, less than clear. Given the stresses and strains, sometimes extreme, that inevitably come into the lives of societies as well as individuals, can we say that freedom would survive in a society in which the great mass of citizens settled comfortably into the belief that human beings are indeed merely material creatures, the product of mindless forces, inhabiting a universe of purely material and efficient causality? That, it seems to me, is a proposition that should be indulged only with the very greatest caution. Thank you very much, my dear friends.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very grateful, as always, to the Federalist Society for inviting me to speak, and particularly to my friend Nick Rosenkranz for making this really delightful series from which I've already learned so much available to us. And I'm also very grateful to be here with my friend Robert George, who made very kind remarks about me, but those are somewhat abstract in the sense that I can make the remark about Professor George is that he has been such a stalwart in the defense of religious freedom, not only here, but around the world in these very difficult times. And so I'm particularly delighted to share the stage with him tonight. So let me lay out my position. It really does come from Adams' quotation, because I think it is in some sense mistaken. It assumes that we can afford to have the Constitution's limited government protecting freedom only because the people are already possessed of an abundance of virtue, and for my remarks, crucially fortified by religion. But the Constitution itself, I think, reflects a somewhat different faith, that a people blessed with a Constitution like our own, including, to be sure, religious freedom, are likely to develop the virtues of self-restraint and social trust needed to thrive. To be sure, I completely agree with Professor George that a certain amount of public virtue and self-restraint are necessary to sustain a good civic life. And religion can certainly help actualize those civic virtues, but so can other kinds of civic practices and culture. And I think the Constitution is premised on the Enlightenment view that its very design can create the necessary virtues for civic life from elements of human nature, in fact, including raw self-interest. The constitutional structure thus tries to maintain itself and doesn't really depend on other outside bulwarks, including religion, although it certainly depends on the possibility of religion. Nothing, of course, in the text of the Constitution assumes any religious belief on part of the American people. The Constitution emphatically does not call for the people to adhere to any particular religion or any religion at all. It prohibits all religious tests for any federal office. And rather than rely on religion, or indeed some thick conception, because there have been other conceptions of virtue that sustain republics, like Sparta, for instance, the framers built the Constitution, I think, on the bedrock of human nature. As Hamilton said before he wrote the George Washington's address, man will serve the public interest only if the structure of the government interests his passions in doing so. And I think, paradoxical as it may seem, Hamilton's view, I think, reflects an important element of Protestant theology at the time, which emphasizes the fallen nature of man as the central problem of politics. Given the unknowability of who actually would be among the elect, I think even many religious believers would have acknowledged it perilous to make the Constitution depend on the uncertain religious state of the populace. Instead of relying on religion, the Constitution has a specific design to elicit the virtues needed for civic life and preservation. First, the Constitution creates a commercial republic to make sure that the self-interest of man helps promote virtue. It's remarkable that except for national defense, almost all the enumerated powers of the federal government, the government created by the Constitution, were meant to facilitate a continental market, to make commerce regular. There are far-reaching implications to the commercial character of American society. It put a premium on self-control and honesty. It required citizens to pass judgment informally on one another's reliability and integrity, since so many decisions had to be based on reputation. And it required the free exchange of information and ideas so that opportunities could be exploited. Thus, commerce rewards civic virtues of self-restraint, fair judgment of others, and social interchange that are indispensable to Republican life. And creating a commercial society generates an ethos that reaches beyond merchants, influencing the orientation of everything inside it, from education to law. For instance, in a society devoted to commerce, education naturally focuses on self-reliance, not the kind of self-indulgence that we see on college campuses today. Political correction, in fact, is in tension with the truth-seeking of the scientific method that is so crucial to commercial innovation. Perhaps most importantly, and here I just want to pause to discuss how the commercial society relates to what we discuss, law, affects the nature of lawyering. In a commercial society, lawyers' bread and butter is private law. And at the time of the founding, the bar stood for the sanctity of contracts and property and the formal legal methods that preserved them. Lawyers were spiritually, as well as often literally, the brothers of merchants. And I think that's the sociological reason that the framers entrusted the legal community through the judiciary with the substantial power of judicial review. Contrast that with what has happened to lawyers after the New Deal. The New Deal created substantially a bureaucratic state, and lawyers turned to manipulating the bureaucracy. And most lawyers turned against vested rights. I think that's really was what's turned law, rather than some lack of religious belief. They saw law as a malleable tool for constitutional transformation, not least because they get a slice of the transaction costs each time there's been a different stage of legal change. Besides encouraging a commercial society, the Constitution also sharply limits government. The federal government is limited by the enumerated powers. The state's capacity to create large, intrusive, anti-commercial government is circumscribed by the right of the citizens to exit. To take just a purely hypothetical example, if my home state of Illinois exacts large taxes in favor of small groups like public sector unions, a few of us may leave. Limited government then creates the space and indeed the need for the kinds of private associations that Alexis de Tocqueville celebrated, what he thought was most distinctive about American society. Varying in size and mission, these associations may concern self-improvement, mutual aid, or social welfare. As the Nobel Prize-winning political scientist Elinor Ostrom has shown, these associations can help people learn to develop the bonds of social trust and long-term relations of reciprocity. Such trust and long-term perspective are also crucial virtues to maintaining a free society. And it's such civic associations that develop the habits that are indeed so important for help us form the backdrop to the reason that is necessary to sustain a republic. Habits are necessary, but these social associations, day in, day out, help them in a commercial society. And look at what else these associations do. They promote a necessary outward judgment about the bad behavior that helps others exercise self-restraint. One of the worst aspects of the welfare state has been its crowding out of private welfare associations that make judgments about the behaviors of individuals, distinguishing those who are needy from no fault of their own and those whose behavior needs to change. Civic associations of this kind that develop the habits that are necessary for a Republican society, they need not be religious. To be sure, they can be, and it is essential that the Constitution protect the freedom of religious institutions to compete with secular ones. To be sure that they, if the secular ones fail to do so, as they well may do, form the habits of virtue that are necessary for a civic society. But it seems to me it's the Constitution that assures that religion will be an aid to civil society, rather than the religion that assures the Constitution will perform that function. It's only religious freedom, not simple religious sentiment, that guarantees that religion will operate in the public interest. After all, the utility of religion to the public order depends crucially on the nature of that religion. Not any religion will do. Of course, radical Islam would destroy civic culture. But also religions like pantheism, which I think is still actually an extant religion, that is behind much of radical environmentalism, would also certainly distend the social order. And there are others too, from Scientology to certain Christian religious cultures, that will be counterproductive. But what the great aspect of the Constitution with respect to religion is that its religion's freedom both moderates religious extremism and intolerance, as religions must compete for adherence, but it also rewards those that expect something in return from its adherents. And so it does something very valuable to generate the religious support that I think a constitution may need in competition with other kinds of civic associations. History has also shown that religion, when it has monopoly power of the state, tends to tyranny. Here again, I think it's the Constitution's Establishment Clause, not religion itself, that's responsible for requiring religious sects to compete without the aid of coercive state power. Limited government also does other things that are very important to sustaining civic virtue because, for instance, it helps, I think, preserve the family. The family is, of course, among other things, a social insurance program that the large state can replace. And Charles Murray, of course, has shown how the federal government's welfare programs can have a destructive effect not only on the family, but importantly on the many virtues of discipline in the areas of finance and self-restraint that are so essential to Republican order. In short, the Constitution itself, if followed, creates a culture that's conducive to a morality of self-restraint, outward judgmentalism. And let me just pause on that word for a moment, because I think much of our plight of our society can be captured in the changing meaning of the word judgmentalism. It was once a virtue to be judgmental appropriately on others' behavior. And today it's thought to be a vice. And I trace that from the loss of both the commercial society and limited government. But also that leads to, and it does so, I think, by creating a structure that harnesses elements of human nature, like self-interest and reciprocal altruism, to create a society in which people can thrive. So I think, let me talk about one possible test, I think, about whether Professor George or I is right. It's, I think, whether periods of greater religiosity coincide with what I'm sure we would both agree is crucial to our essential constitutional order, fidelity to the Constitution itself. I think if we look at the course of American history, we don't find a high degree of correlation, let alone causal connection, between periods of greater religiosity and fidelity to the Constitution. Let me be clear that it does not show a positive correlation between secularism and constitutional fidelity either. Rather, I think our constitutional history underscores that the greatest dangers to our constitutional order come from an excess of religious political enthusiasm or of secular utopianism. Both have an ecstatic approach to politics that finds the Constitution's constraints a roadblock to creating a pattern of society that is somehow more virtuous than that generated by the spontaneous order of freedom, including religious freedom. It's not only that the Constitution can be preserved by the liberal order it encourages, it can be destabilized by demands for an official morality that is too encompassing. Indeed, I think in a very interesting recent book, The Evangelical Origins of the Living Constitution, John Compton makes an important case that living constitutionalism, and of course I don't need to remind this audience that that's the theory that upends our written Constitution, has its beginnings in the Second Great Awakening. These evangelicals and their religious descendants became very unhappy that the Constitution as written facilitated such vices as alcohol and gambling by protecting interstate commerce and vested rights and property. They therefore promoted legislation that empowered the federal government, as opposed to the states, to regulate morals, despite the limitations of the enumerated power. And they also wanted to destroy property that they thought used for immoral purposes, despite the protection of vested rights. And I think it's the precedent set by this movement, this is what Compton argues, became key for progressive arguments. Just as the Constitution could be transformed to permit moral reform on a grand scale, so it could be made to justify federal control of the economy. And let me take a look a bit more carefully, even at the quoted issue in this debate, because I do think it illustrates how claims of religion in politics can sometimes actually undermine constitutional fidelity. John Adams, of course, was a Federalist, and the early Republic's equivalent of a Federalist attack ad was that the Democratic Republicans were unreliable deists and scoffers of the faith. Thus, Adams here, I think, may be conjuring up the culture war of the 1790s. But sadly, during exactly the same year that he was playing up the bulwark afforded by his party's religious values, he signed into law the Alien and Sedition Acts. Even more than 200 years later, this legislation still ranks as one of the most egregiously unconstitutional acts in our entire history. Thus, Adams' earnest claims of religiosity provided little assurance at that time of his constitutional fidelity. So let me end with our current period and on a more practical note. If I'm right, we can revive a flourishing civic life by restoring the Constitution and not waiting on a religious revival. Sociologists tell us, at least, that religious belief, at least as measured by adherence to organized religion, is declining somewhat in the United States. Yet I believe enthusiasm for constitutional fidelity is rising. From the 1960s to the 1980s, a constitutional challenge such as that mounted against Obamacare would have been unimaginable, even though religious belief was more widespread. Today, but not back then, a Republican president is required by his political base to nominate someone part of that culture of constitutional fidelity. And note that that culture is created in no small part by that kind of secular civic association of which Tocqueville talked about, the society before which we're talking. We saw a remarkable instance of that culture's power, and the society's power, I might say, when George W. Bush was forced to withdraw Harriet Myers, a candidate who had no proven record of sound constitutional interpretation. And let me be clear, as Obergefell suggests, our legal culture is far from perfect. But it's a lot better if you read than the opinions of the years of the Warren or even Burger Court, where religious adherence was somewhat higher, but support for interpreting the Constitution as written was entirely feeble, both academically and politically. And I think the reasons for this greater enthusiasm for constitutional fidelity lie in the fact that after the Reagan administration, respect for free markets, federalism, and limited government matters at the core of our constitutional order grew even as society may have become less, not more religious. Thus, it seems our Constitution is not ultimately made for a people who must be faithful to a religion, but for a people who must have the civic virtues to be faithful to the Constitution. And those virtues, in turn, are likely to be generated by following the Constitution as written. It is to that virtuous circle for civic virtue to which we need to return.
Okay, we're going to begin with a bit of an exchange now that they've made their initial presentations. But in so doing, I want to turn first to you, Professor George, and give you an opportunity to have at least a brief response to Professor McGinnis. But in doing so, I hope you will answer his charge of any religion?
Certainly not any religion. Not environmentalism, that's for sure. And one of the several points on which I agree with John is that radical environmentalism is a revival of pantheism. It's a pseudo-religion. It doesn't, to sustain civic virtue over the long haul, and an understanding of rights as not simply the gifts of human authorities like kings and presidents. I do agree with Washington and with Adams that you need religion, you need a commitment to the transcendent, the spiritual, to be abroad in the nation. Doesn't mean that every single individual, as he himself pointed out, they themselves pointed out, doesn't mean that every individual needs to be devout, but there needs to be a flourishing religious life. Now, as I observed, that doesn't mean that the religion has to be Judaism or Christianity, much less any particular kind of Judaism or Christianity, even though it was from those biblical traditions that we got some of the fundamental moral principles that made possible our civic order. There's no straight line derivation of our civic principles from the Bible, but no one can credibly claim that this tradition didn't significantly shape the understanding of the civic order that produced our Constitution. At the same time, while there can be many different religious bases for the kinds of virtues that we need to sustain a constitution of freedom, there are also types of religion that will undermine civic freedom, types of religion that are simply incompatible on theological grounds with our kind of civic freedom. And that's so self-evident from the world today or at any point in human history that it doesn't even need to be argued for. I want to agree with another point that John made. I think there's a point that he makes that makes him half right in the overall debate. Our founders didn't believe, and they were right not to believe, that religion by itself could be counted on to sustain freedom. That we don't have to worry about limiting government in order to do that. That if we have virtuous people, they won't need the constitutional structures that limit government. In Federalist 51, we get a clear statement of this. In view of the picture of human nature that we get, for example, in Federalist 10, we learn in a very Protestant, very negative view of human nature. In Federalist 51, we're told that the Constitution tries to, by pitting rival interests against each other, remedy the defect of better motives for people respecting freedom. But at the same time, in the very same paper, in 51, we're told that that is a subsidiary advice, that the primary control on government to ensure that it does not transgress freedom and usurp the authority of the people is the people themselves. And a people that is not virtuous is not going to be able to exercise that kind of control. If all we were left with were the constitutional structures, if we didn't have to rely on anything else to produce the kinds of virtues in our people that enable freedom to flourish, it would be over for freedom in a matter of a few years. John now rightly says, here's the point on which I think he's wrong, so there's the half wrong point. John says it's the Constitution and fidelity to the Constitution that will produce people who have the kinds of virtues, selflessness, civic-mindedness, compassion, fairness, willingness to take responsibility for others, willingness to take risks and even make the ultimate sacrifice on behalf of the nation. If those virtues flourish, they are not going to come as the result of the government or even as the result of the Constitution. They will come as the result of the family. And it will come as a result of the family assisted by institutions of civil society, beginning with the religious institutions of the people. Families and religious institutions, the little platoons, as Burke called them, the institutions of civil society, have an indispensable role to play in sustaining freedom. That doesn't mean that they have an exclusive role to play, or that the quality of the Constitution won't itself be a factor in the virtue of the people. On that, John's right. That's the half-right part. What our founders understood, and Federalist 51 makes this abundantly clear, is that you really do need both. You need institutions of civil society, beginning with the family and religion, to inculcate and transmit the virtues necessary for the civic order. And you need constitutional structures that will not only remedy the defect of better motives, but also themselves contribute to the virtues of the people that are needed to sustain liberty. Oh, and on that, John, on that point about, of course, how does religiosity equate one way or another with how the Supreme Court behaves when it comes to actually respecting the idea of limited government and the rule of law, and respecting the idea of judicial restraint. If we divided the current court up into the secularists and the devout, the secularists would be, well, you know who they are. And the devout would be, you know who they are too.
So, Professor McGinnis, this really takes up on Professor George's last point. Is it not true that with increasing secularization, particularly of the kind that you are surrounded by in your daily work, there is a loss. There is a loss of appreciation for our constitutional ideals. I think to the luncheon address today, or the luncheon discussion, where Kirsten Powers was explaining how the secular left has lost its appreciation for the First Amendment protection of freedom of speech. So, with the loss of religion, aren't we losing an appreciation for our Constitution?
Well, if I look at the way originalism has developed, again, I certainly agree that if you look at the court, as Robbie has suggested, that the secularists seem to be people who are less respectful of the text of the Constitution, although certainly some of the one of the key votes in Obergefell was not that way. I think taking the longer.
I don't know about that, but we can discuss that.
I think the longer view, there were many people who were devoutly religious on the Warren Court, and I think if we look at the whole structure of the debate, it's hard to look at those opinions without saying that people even on the conservative side didn't really understand the first thing about reading the Constitution as written. Even people were celebrated as conservatives then. So I think that really has been a sea change, and I don't think we can attribute that to a greater religiosity among the theorists of originalism. I don't think that's happened. I do think maybe one thing that's happened, I think, is a certain sense of what in the academy has taken a more serious view about right and wrong. I think maybe 9/11, I think, had an effect, and I think many of the sort of radical theories of deconstruction, I think, took a big hit then, quite appropriately so. And I think it took a hit among not only religious, but not people who are not religious. But I do not think it is the case, and this is a philosophical debate that goes back to Plato, to the Euthyphro. I don't think it's the case that morality depends on religion, or in other words, that one in thinking that morality is not a gift from God or not a gift from humans, one can think that morality is just a transcendent fact without God. Of course, Plato makes the point that there's somewhat of a difficulty in deciding that the good is what God loves, because that denudes the good or morality of independent force. So I do think there needs to be some idea of transcendence. I don't think that needs philosophically to be lodged in religion. Now, it is true that people may not capture that idea of transcendence, and that's hard to do. I think what's important about the Constitution, and I agree with you entirely, and this is where I think you're half right as well, that you need a culture that reinforces the reason that I think you could come to a transcendental morality without, as I think you would admit, without religion. You need certain habits that will lead you to that. And I think the Constitution creates that culture through commerce and limited government. It creates a very powerful culture for self-reliance and responsibility. So to put your own interest in favor of coming to the reason of a transcendental morality, whether religiously based or not. And that kind of culture permits religion to be one of the competitors, to force that. So in some sense, I think the difference between us is not a large one. My claim would be that absolutely the Constitution requires the possibility of religion revival, religious civic associations, because the secular associations might, as an empirical matter, not form these virtues. But that is not something the Constitution depends on. It doesn't require any sort of religion, but what it does, the original Constitution, it requires the kind of commercial society and limited government that creates that culture and habits, with religion as one of the possible competitors to it.
Peter Berger, the great sociologist Peter Berger, famously said that if Sweden is the least religious country in the world, and India is the most religious country in the world, the United States is a nation of Indians governed by Swedes. Our elite is a Swedish elite. And I think the country today is divided in a way that it never has been before between a powerful secular elite, whether we're looking at the arts, whether we're looking at education, journalism, philanthropy, in some ways even religion itself. Between an elite that's extremely secular, European-like, and of people who still are, on the whole, especially by comparison with Europe, for example, pretty religious. I don't know about you, but I'd rather be governed by the religious than by the Swedes.
I would rather be governed by people of virtue rather than either, right? I think that's my view, and
well, our country has these two, is divided, right? So the secular and the religious. Where would you expect, among whom, let's put it this way, among whom would you expect to find people who would be more respectful of freedom?
I think that may well be the case. I think that's sort of contingent to the Constitution, right? It may well be the case that at any particular time, religion will be important. I don't think it is an essential truth about the Constitution. Let me just take up something Professor George said for a moment.
Sure.
About, you said, well, some of the religions aren't so good either. I mean, one of the good things about, I think, if you look at the competition in religion, some of the religions that have thinned out religion, I think have not done very well in the religious marketplace. And that's actually different from some of the religions in, for instance, Sweden, which have established churches, which actually may be quite subversive because the religious orientation is sort of captured by the state. The kind of religions that, I don't want to name any names here, but the kind of religions that thin themselves out are going to be replaced precisely because they don't have the kind of willingness of self-sacrifice that I think you see in some religious associations as well as some other sorts of civic associations. And that's the genius of the Constitution, that it puts them in competition and brings up the religions that actually may be useful in enforcing virtue. So nothing I have said suggests that religion might not be helpful, but that it is not, I think, an essential truth about the Constitution in the way that the creation of a commercial society and a limited government is.
Well, if that is true, then is the Constitution designed to produce those religious people who will be virtuous. I think you've just made the argument for that, haven't you?
It will certainly produce religions that are useful to civic virtue. All I'm saying is they'll produce other kinds of institutions that are useful to civic virtue, and indeed force them to compete in some sense. Again, if we had the kind of society that the original Constitution talked about, a society of commerce and of limited government, where so many more public goods would be being produced by that civic order rather than by government itself.
Do we want to open it up?
Sure.
So we have some time for questions from the floor. Because we started late, we're going to end a little late today. But I do have one admonition.
The usual one?
It is.
No speed.
You're given an opportunity to ask a question. Please remember that it needs to be a question. And with that, we'll start here at the front.
Yes, Your Honor. Professor McGinnis, you said that the Constitution was designed to create virtue, but presumably the virtues and the civic organizations and the civic dedication you said that it would create existed before the Constitution. I mean, we weren't bereft of virtue and civic organizations before the Constitution was written. But at the time the Constitution was written, the United States was a religious country. Religious belief was widespread. So how do you explain the fact that the virtue you say would be created the Constitution predated the Constitution? It did not predate religious fervor in the United States.
Absolutely. I certainly would not disagree that I think any historian of human rights would have to see as a historical matter that the creation of human rights, Christianity and Judeo-Christianity played an extremely important role in that. Nevertheless, there also were dangers of religion that posed a danger to the social order, and my claim is that the Constitution, while it certainly is inspired by religion to have certain of the rights in the Constitution, that's not basically its structure of how it's going to sustain itself. And I think one of the reasons for that is I think they're not, while you say everyone's religious at the time, people are not quite sure if people are truly religious. Do they actually, they may say they're religious, but does that make them religious? I think Calvinists in particular were very wary of being sure of who was among the elect. And so actually I think there's some religious reasons, even internal to the religion at the time, that would make people very cautious about setting up an organism that wasn't just for 30 years or 40 years where people may think that they would continue the kind of religion that they saw, but for the indefinite period. That would have been a particularly dangerous proposition. So I don't think I disagree with anything you said, but I think if you think about the religion at the time and the religious understanding at the time, that it would have been completely consistent with setting up a constitution that didn't depend on that contingency.
Judge, would it be not in keeping with the spirit of the debate if I developed a little bit of point of John's that I agree with? Is that okay?
That's fine.
Okay. All right. It strikes me, John, that one of the things that you could and should argue, because it's true, is that a sound constitution, like ours, if we'd only live with it, live by it, a sound constitution can also have a positive impact on religions. We've already agreed that there are good and bad religions. Even among good religions, a sound constitution can have a good impact. And we have a very concrete example of this, I think. The Catholic Church, through the entire history of its existence, certainly through the 19th century and well into the 20th century, was in its official teachings quite skeptical about democracy and religious freedom. Today, the Catholic Church is a champion of democracy and religious freedom. In the pontificate of John Paul II, the Church was an amazing force for democracy and religious freedom. How did that happen? Well, part of the story of how that happened is the American constitutional experience. The understanding of the Catholic Church toward religious freedom, just to use the most important example, had been shaped by the French Revolution. It was mainly a European church. The leadership of the church was dominated by Europeans. There were 500 years of popes from one country alone, from Italy. Right? And the basic understanding of religious freedom was shaped, what it is, what it means, was shaped by the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution, of course, that image of religious freedom, which eventually ends up with producing French laïcité, is one in which religious freedom is associated with the idea that no religion is actually true, or all religions are equally true or equally false, or that people shouldn't take religious vows because religious vows are binding your conscience against future changes of mind, or that taking religious vows is immoral, or that taking religious vows is not a serious thing and doesn't need to be taken seriously, and of course the complete subservience of the church to the state. Well, if you're the Catholic Church and that's what you think religious freedom means, then you're going to probably come out against it, and probably come out against it very strong. I'm Catholic myself, so I'm not speaking out of turn here. What did the American experience with religious freedom, and especially the American constitutional doctrine of religious freedom, teach Catholicism? It showed a different understanding, showed that a different understanding of religious freedom was possible, one in which none of the aspects of the French Revolutionary concept of religious freedom were part of the picture. Indeed, as Tocqueville noticed as early as the 1830s, religion could flourish in circumstances of freedom where you have a sound understanding of religious freedom. So by 1965, there is an important model of religious freedom that's shaping the ideas of Catholic thinkers across the globe, but it's really beginning in the United States. And in 1965, 50 years ago, John, this year, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary, the Church at the Second Vatican Council produces a document called Dignitatis Humanae, Human Dignity, which embraces a full-throated, robust understanding of religious freedom, making it possible for the Church to become such a force for religious freedom in the world. You were kind enough to say nice things about my own witness for religious freedom, and my witness is shaped by my Catholic understanding of religious freedom. So I think that while religion can have an extremely positive role, on this point we agree, I think even necessary role when it comes to large societies over large expanses of time in preserving the cultural conditions of liberty. It's also true that sound constitutionalism can move religions toward a better understanding of liberty as well.
Looks like, Professor McGinnis, that it helped to have a religious person on your side in making your case.
Well, indeed, I think I think it's very important to understand that I am not arguing in some sort of Harris-like way against religion. The question is, what is essential about the Constitution, and is religion a competitor among many of civic associations? That's the question.
In the back.
Thank you, Your Honor. Professor McGinnis, I understand your proposition to be that the Constitution itself, as originally understood, combined with human nature, creates the virtue necessary to maintain freedom. And my question would be, is that in and of itself sufficient? Consider in a society devoid of religion, is the constitutional structure itself sufficient to maintain liberty absent a religious society?
But that is I think you're restating the question in the debate, and my answer is yes. And again, I just want to make clear that it suggests that religion can be useful, but that I don't think the Constitution puts its thumb on the side of religion. It doesn't suggest that religion may be necessary. What it suggests is necessary.
Well, that's not the issue. It's not whether the Constitution, but it's whether religion is a necessary support, to use Washington's language.
I think, but the question is whether it's designed for no other, that it can work with no other kind of people. And I don't think the Constitution believes that. And I think there are reasons to think that's not the case.
But you see, those are two different questions. Question one is the Constitution designed for a moral and religious people? Question two, and that's the point on which we disagree. Question two is, does the Constitution put a thumb on the scale in favor of religion?
No.
I'm not arguing that.
No, I understand that, but I don't think the Constitution is designed for that, because what it does is allow different kinds of civic associations to create these kinds of public goods. I think that's the way the Constitution is designed, and I don't think there's any, and what's necessary about the Constitution is to allow that possibility of competition under the conditions that lead to virtue, commerce, limited government, the kinds of ways in which those associations are likely to be directed, as Professor George has suggested, on behalf of freedom rather than the way they may be directed in some other kind of society.
John, looking forward to the next few decades, where it's possible, of course, if trends continue, that the country could become more secularist, not only more secular, but more secularist, and possibility of religious revivals, which are all and going the other direction. Would you be, from the point of view of concern for the vitality of the constitutional order, would you be indifferent about whether it becomes dominantly secularist?
Indifferent, I think, is, I mean, I have my own views that I think...
just for the sake of, I know you might have your own views about whether it's good in general to be secularist or not, but just to stay with the debate, looked at from the point of view of preserving constitutional liberty, would you be indifferent if you knew that, well, it's likely that we'll become more secularist?
I think the crucial questions that would overwhelm that, by my looking at history, is whether we would have a stronger commercial society and a more limited government. As I suggested, that at times, if I may say, at times in constitutional history, I do not think it is always the case that religiously inspired movements want to maintain the Constitution. So I'm not actually confident of that. I mean, in other words, a demand for too encompassing a morality, I think, can be very destabilizing to the Constitution. So I'm not actually confident of that. I mean, I personally, I think, would welcome a more religiously oriented society, but I don't think that I'm confident that that's actually going to deliver more constitutional virtue, at least in the same sense that I'm confident that if we revive a more limited government and a more a commercial society, I think those are much more likely to create the culture that we need to revive the Constitution.
Let me just stipulate that we'll have a commercial society, but to make sure that there's no question begging going on here, what if I put it this way? If your concern is to make sure that we have a good shot at maintaining the degree of limited government we have, which isn't that much, and maybe even advancing the cause of limited government a bit, would you be indifferent as between secularism and religion, or would you say, no, if we're really interested in limited government, we're more likely to get it if there's a flourishing religious culture?
Well, in this sense, this limited sense, what I do worry, and this is not so much because, this is really because we've gone so far from the original Constitution. I really took this topic to be, what is the original meaning of the Constitution? Is it originally contemplate that religion is necessary? That, I think, is also a slightly different question from the question you're asking me. Contingently now, would more religion virtue be? I think that's probably the case. I'm actually arguing a somewhat more abstract and original proposition. Assuming we had the Constitution of limited government and commercial virtue, there it's not clear to me that either more or less religion would be likely to maintain it. Today, that's, I think, a different question. And again, I'm an originalist, and so I always take and interpret a question in its original meaning.
But I wonder if the case is even harder for you if you go back to the original Constitution, because the big witnesses are against you.
I don't agree with that, actually, because I think, even with respect to, you spent a lot of time on George Washington's farewell address. You have to remember that George Washington, I think, is also, as you adverted, really trying to attack Thomas Jefferson. I think we're in an era of party politics then, and if you look actually at the first version of the farewell address. I don't think that language is included. So I do think let's.
Wait a minute,
So, and
we're
I-
the textualists, John. We go with the language that's in there.
So, Professor McGinnis, I guess that returns to Professor George's question earlier to you. Are the originalists on the court who are trying to bring back that Constitution religious?
Well, you're absolutely right, but again, I think it's as we would say in an I come from an empirical law school. We have a very small n when we're talking about that. And if you look at the more general originalist academic movement, I actually don't see very much relation between religious commitment one way or the other with respect to that. And again, if you have a longer view of history,
Well, that
if
assumes,
you go back to
that assumes, though, that the academics are really having much of a role to play.
well, I think
That was just a joke.
Well, I don't have much of a role to play, but I think everyone can acknowledge that in this room, Randy Barnett was so crucial to the Obamacare, and I think that is absolutely an important essence. But let me just go back for a moment to the course of American history. I think you have to go back to the Warren Court era, the Burger Court era, and you just see no real defenders of what I think both Professor George and I would agree as constitutional fidelity. And many of those people would have professed themselves to be religious, of course, very religious. And obviously, one goes back to my point. It's really very difficult to be too confident just because people profess their religion that they're actually going to be bulwarks of the Constitution.
I've got to apologize, but this was a debate that was supposed to end at 5:15, and we've gone well over that. Of course, we did start late. This is, so we really don't have an opportunity for more. This could go on quite a while, as you can tell. This is the final event of this year's convention. I think it's fitting that we thank the organizers of this year's convention. That is both the organizers and officers, but particularly the staff and the volunteers that make the convention possible. We are in a debt of gratitude for a terrific, as usual, convention. Our reception will follow immediately across the hall. Unless you wonder at all how I could have been up here at this particular moment on a Saturday afternoon, I'll have you know that the Crimson Tide is winning 21-3 at the half.
Thanks, Judge.